Hey folks, Michael Mann from Michael Mann Security Services. Do you need an armed guard to protect your facility? So let's look at this from a risk-based approach, because this is a question that I get a lot when we do security assessments. In fact, it's probably the most frequently questioned asked. Do we need an armed responder here, a school resource officer, an armed guard? So let's look at this from a risk-based approach. So risk is your exposure to some sort of a hazard. Risk is always measured by multiplying threat or likelihood. So like, is this going to happen? Your vulnerability or susceptibility to an attack itself. And then also consequence or the impact of this occurring. So let's look at threat or likelihood. In the United States of America, when we talk about schools, so we're talking about placing a guard, an armed guard, or a school resource officer at your school. So there's about 140,000 schools in the U.S. And here's what I mean by schools. We've got about 100,000 public schools, K through 12 in the U.S. We've got about 34 to 35,000 private schools in the United States of America. And then we have an additional 4,000 plus colleges and universities. Now, I don't know how many preschools there are, but statistically, when I last looked, we're talking about like school year 2019 to 2020, there were like 1.62 million children enrolled in some sort of pre-K program at a facility. So, man, that's a lot of kids. So there's probably a whole lot of preschools in the U.S. So we're looking at, if we omit the preschool piece, because again, I don't really know the total number of facilities that are providing those services, we're talking about 140,000 schools. In the last 20 years, I think we've had mid-50s, low 60 number of active assailant attacks in the school. So 140,000 schools, last 20 years, let's just say it's 60 active assailant attacks at those schools, not counting the preschools. In fact, statistically for preschools, I don't ever remember seeing anything about a preschool being attacked. So really the likelihood of that occurring at your school, your private, even your public school, and really your preschool, the likelihood is minimal. Let's talk about vulnerability. This system weakness is what some people call it. So this, how susceptible are you to this? Well, vulnerabilities, and when we look at this in armed guards do not reduce your vulnerability number. In fact, most of the time, they increase it when we look at numbers and vulnerabilities. The armed responder can be your vulnerability, and that's because of a lack of training, a lack of situational awareness. And the most important thing to remember about active assailants, especially today, just because of the evil that we're dealing with, active assailants and their active planning or their attack cycle plan around the school resource officers and the armed guards. We saw that at Columbine, we saw that at Parkland, we see that in school attacks all the time. And sometimes they intentionally engage with the armed responder. Now, here's what an armed guard will provide you. They will provide you an immediate response to that active assailant threat, but there are questions because of the vulnerabilities. One, will the armed responder respond? They don't legally have to, even if you're paying for those services to have an armed guard there. And, two, are they trained to do that? So not only will they, but are they really trained to provide that kind of service? And I will tell you, in the armed guard realm or that industry, they are not. They are not. So not only do the armed guards create a vulnerability, but again, a lot of times the question comes into, will they respond, or have they been trained to do that? Again, they can respond. They provide that immediate response, but a lot of times the armed responder is part of that vulnerability number or that piece. And then, of course, consequence, folks, that's our last piece of this. And the consequence or impact is always going to be high. Always, because we're talking about protecting human beings. So remember, your goal here is, to answer the question, your goal is to, number one, figure out what your vulnerabilities are through an assessment and lessen those vulnerabilities. That is the big piece of this. And remember, the armed guard can always be part of that vulnerability number. So always understand what the scope of this contract, that's what you're going to do, is going to be. And then we're going to talk about some other things later on in another video that tell you what to look for in an armed guard service. All right, folks, I hope that helped. Hopefully you saw the newsletter about this. If you have any questions, you can get me at contact@michaelmannsecurityservice.com, or you can always call me at 615-956-3912. And remember, it's about prevention, not response.